be sure to check out my second channel called Rob Explains. There you can check out videos where I explain things outside of comic books. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, instead of writing out a script for this, what I want to do is have fun with it. A script is usually a good idea if it's something like the little documentary thing that I'm doing for a history of the Marvel Universe. But I think with a story like this that I absolutely love, I think it's easier to just sort of run through it kind of off the cuff. So in the previous video that I had done on this, we had talked about how following the events of Civil War, Reed Richards had basically come to this realization that it was inevitable that humanity would destroy itself. And so because he was effectively the smartest person in the world, he had basically taken it upon himself to solve the problem of everything. Now, while Hickman doesn't directly give it to us, what he tells us is that somewhere along the line, Reed had developed a multidimensional bridge, meaning he could access other dimensions and other universes, and that after he had done this, he had begun speaking with disembodied voices, but didn't really know who he was talking to. But after getting in and talking to those individuals, he basically discovered they were alternate reality versions of himself who had come together to form something called the Council of Reeds, which is basically an amalgamation of all these different versions of Reed Richards who would all come together to solve the problem of everything. Now, where the first video covered how we were given a tour of these different realities and the different steps that were taken to solve the problem of everything, what Hickman does in this comic here in issue number 572 is basically show us how much hubris the council has. And what I mean here is that where hubris is basically just excessive pride or extreme arrogance, what Hickman's telling us is that because all these different versions of Reed Richards had taken it upon themselves to solve the problem of everything, they effectively saw themselves as fixers. Everything was within their ability to fix. But with these celestials that appear from the Earth 4280 reality, we learn that's not the case. Now, in the last video, we had talked about how these celestials hailed from a universe where they had gone mad with power. Instead of just being explorers and chroniclers of science and technology like in the current Marvel universe, they had come to the conclusion that because they were so powerful, they should rule that universe. The Mad Celestials had come together and wiped out that universe's version of eternity and the other cosmic entities, and then forced the inhabitants of that universe to begin worshipping the Celestials. And so while one of these versions of Reed was housed within that reality and exploring, he had stumbled across the Celestials, and in turn, the Celestials basically took apart his mind, read his thoughts, and discovered the existence of the Council, and looked to use the various dimensional portals of this Council of Reeds to access other realities and essentially take over the multiverse. And so what this does is this picks up with those particular series of events, and it shows us that the Celestials are essentially laying waste to everyone. And what I mean is that none of these Reeds stand a chance. Now, this is very, very important here, and the reason why this is a big deal is because while these Reeds are running for weapons and different things like that, one of the first questions we would ask is that if 3 of these Reeds have Infinity Gauntlets, why can't they use them? Well, like we saw in the last video, the Infinity Gauntlets can only be used in the reality that they hail from. And because the Council of Reeds is located in this place outside of all time and space, the gauntlets don't natively work there. And so what happens is that one of the Reed Richards who has an Infinity Gauntlet speaks to another version of Reed whose body is essentially a portal to his native dimension. And so the Reed with the Infinity Gauntlet sticks his hand into the portal, which basically allows him to just dip his toe, so to speak, into his own reality, and by virtue of that, use the Infinity Gauntlet. But what's really funny about this is that it still doesn't work. Because the Mad Celestials appear to be so powerful, whether it's because they evolved differently or they absorbed other individuals isn't made clear. But because of the power that they possess, even if only a handful are wiped out, more just keep coming. Now, what Hickman is indirectly telling us is that because the Celestials in the main Marvel universe exist by way of literally planting their seeds in planets and then allowing the Celestials to emerge in those planets, Galactus was most likely destroyed when the Mad Celestials took over, meaning there was no one to consume the planets to keep the Celestials from being born. And so the result is that these Celestials most likely took over the reality, not in just power, but in sheer population. And so with the Mad Celestials laying waste to the Council and the main Earth 616 Reed Richards making his escape, he travels back to the Baxter building, closes the portal, barely making it out alive, and begins grabbing up different arms and armament. Now what I want to do here is I want to sidetrack away from what Reed Richards is doing for a second, and I want to focus on Franklin and Valeria. Now this is not wildly important for the events that are transpiring with the Mad Celestials, but it will be important later on. And the reason why is because all of this is basically about Franklin Richards. The entirety of Hickman's run is literally about Franklin Richards. I know it doesn't seem like it now, But as we get further into this and we start seeing Franklin Richards from the future, we'll begin to see just how important these events are to his character. And so what we're basically seeing is Franklin and Valeria just kind of enjoying themselves, messing around with the different artifacts around the Baxter building. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar, Valeria is a character who is wildly intelligent. In fact, she's about as intelligent as both Reed Richards and Dr. Doom, despite the fact that she's just a child. And of course, Franklin Richards has the power to warp reality. But something that I want you guys to take note of here is that in this story and within this point in Marvel's timeline, Franklin Richards had already lost his powers. They had been burned out. And they had been since the original Abraxas saga when he resurrected Galactus and destroyed Abraxas. Now, if you guys are interested, we can have a discussion on that at some future point in time, but all we really need to know is that at this point in the story, Franklin cannot warp reality. He really can't do anything. He's effectively just a normal boy. Now, at this point, we go back to Reed Richards as he's gathering different arms and armament together, and we actually pick up with Susan Storm. Now, again, this element of Susan and the element of Franklin and Valeria is going to be important in the next couple pages. And the reason for this is that in the previous events, in the last video, we had talked about how Susan and Reed had had some bit of a falling out, and this was due to the fact that Reed was just constantly preoccupied. He basically wasn't paying attention to his family. And within Marvel Comics, Susan Storm is very family-oriented. She's effectively the person that seems to be holding everything together. And so from her perspective, because Reed seems so isolated and so removed from her and the children, as well as Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm, it seems as though Reed doesn't care about them. Now, the reason why this is important is because as we transition back to the Council of Reeds, with Reed Richards traveling back to try to get everybody all the arms they need to defeat the Celestials, while they are successful in doing this, once the conflict is over, we end up finding out there's a much darker side to the Council of Reeds. And what I mean here is that in addition to the Council going through and essentially lobotomizing all these different versions of Dr. Doom, who had displayed evil that just simply couldn't be corrected, we also learned that these versions of Reed had all given up their families. From the dimensions that they hail from, in order to solve the problem of everything, it required the totality of their mind and the totality of their focus, and the result was that they basically abandoned their families. Now, this point right here is the entire crux of this story, and this is why the end result of everything is so important. And so, if there's nothing else that you remember from this story, please remember this one thing. But the way that we learn this is that with the version of Reed Richards who had accidentally run into the Mad Celestials and initiated this entire conflict in the first place, his conversation with the main Earth 616 version of Reed tells us that as time progressed, as they began to move away, as he spent less and less time with his family, Susan Storm from his reality began to get angry and eventually walked away from him. The children, Franklin Richards and Valeria Richards, did the same thing. Johnny Storm, Ben Grimm, it was all the same process. In addition to this, that reality's version of Captain America, the Avengers, all the Earth superheroes slowly began to forget about Reed Richards to the point that he didn't exist or people didn't know who he was. And so even if he were to go back, they probably wouldn't recall him, with the exception of his closest family members who probably wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. And so when the Earth 616 version of Reed is confronted with this information, he immediately says no. He says absolutely not. There's no way he's going to abandon his family for the sake of trying to solve the problem of everything, because for him, it's too important. Now again, this is wildly important. This is very, very significant. These first few issues are really the foundation for everything, which is why I keep stressing how important they are. Now, the reason why Reed Richards chose to stay with his family is explained to us when we get another flashback with his father, Nathaniel. Now, this is actually a point that's kind of been dipped on occasionally over the course of Marvel Comics, but not really. In the previous video, we had talked about how Nathaniel Richards, the father of Reed, was basically absentee throughout his childhood. While there were moments where Nathaniel Richards had traveled and appeared and made his presence known to Reed Richards and even engaged with him a little while, for the most part, Reed grew up without a dad. And the result is that he knows how it feels to not have a father. And so for him to be given the option or to be told that he has to do the same thing his father did and abandon his family in order to solve the problem of everything, for him, it just doesn't work. He can't square that circle. And so what we find is that he begins to reflect on his experiences with Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, his love for Susan Storm, but he also keeps the advice that his father gave him to be a better man than he was, to be a better father, to be a better husband. And so once Reed comes to this realization, he effectively steps out of his office and begins to reconnect with Susan Storm. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. We're going to wrap things up. And what we'll actually find in the next video is that the Fantastic Four from Hickman's run It's actually going to start tying into other events, and while a lot of this isn't wildly important, we're going to go ahead and cover it anyway, just because there's a few things that pop up here and there that are again going to contribute to the larger story and towards the end events regarding the adult version of Franklin Richards returning to the past. With that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.